And okay, all right, folks. I think this is our last class, so I think I had enough material for 4 classes. So that's why I'm not showing too many videos. And as we talked all about human evolution, some basic principles of genetics. And today I'm going to concentrate more on the health aspects of genes and evolution, which may be familiar with some of the physicians type of thing, but there is some new stuff that should be of interest to all of us. Now, I think the last thing we had talked about this just because I'm not an obstetrician, and I did straight medicine internship, so I didn't have a whole lot of experience with OBGYN, but this fascinated me as to how some of the, even though we are all mammals, some of the principles are different, that most mammals do not have menstrual cycles, only a few monkeys and a couple of the bats do menstruate, so it's an amazing this thing as to how the process has evolved, as to the concealed ovulation, and that may be a way to hide and get the males to get more involved in pregnancy type of thing. And I think we did a study, I think I did some class in which I had the study as to how there are subtle signals that female body gives out at the time of ovulation, even though ovulation is concealed, that somebody had done a study. I don't know who financed this. Oh yeah, this was during the census class, that some lap dancers got more tips when they were ovulating. If they were on pills, they didn't get enough tip. I don't know what research university funded this study and as to how that went about. That was a hilarious thing. So that's just a trivia type thing. So, and so it was one of those things as to how, and also the evolutionary. I have a slide of evolutionary faults or mismatches, but I included the one for wrong location of the testes, Okay, and I think every, this is a bit risque joke, but I will just tell you, just to break the ice, so to speak, that a couple of doctors in Tennessee were arguing about they were creationists, even though they strongly believed in creation theory. They were in Nashville. So one cardiologist said, "Look at how it is perfect it is." Okay, I mean only God could have designed it. Okay, neurologist said, "Okay, yeah, only the brain, God could have designed brain, type thing. It's such a perfect instrument, so complex, A urologist had to say, I'm sorry, guys, I think you're wrong as to who would put the testes outside where they could be hurt, and who would put the connection between the testicles that goes up and all the way winds around the ureter, and who would put prostate in such a way that it can squeeze the urethral flow. And that last was more risque. It's like, who would put evacuation system in a recreation zone? So that was the that was the thing. Okay, so he must be a bad engineer, So that was the joke that is well known in between the, I think, I don't know where I read it, in Dawkins' book or somewhere else. That okay, so this was one of the explanations type thing. And obviously a lot of the women know about as to how, and only humans have this head that rotates twice during labor and delivery. And so no wonder that it is a whole created the profession of midwives and obstetricians. And even Lucy, the earlier, I think I'm hearing somebody static, so I don't know if everybody's muted or not. Okay, all right, I think, yeah. Oh no, I think everybody is. Anyway, so it's disappeared. Hopefully it will stay away. Okay, and Lucy, the early hominoid, had only one rotation. That was, I don't know how they figured that out, but that's beyond me. And apes don't have any rotation of the head, So that's why the, chimpanzees mother can just reach out and pull the baby out, so to speak, and that's why there is a big risk of wrapping of the cord, and that can cause asphyxia and cause a serious problem during labor and delivery. Okay, all right. So I think, okay, so that's just, so I'm sure a lot of, so that's one of the reasons why labor and delivery is and the chimp babies are faced with the face up towards the nipple. So that was, and while the human baby looks at the mom looking at the back, at the tailbone, so to speak. So there are, it's evolutionary. There are dramatic differences between a process of labor and delivery. So it was interesting trivia. Okay. And this, we already talked enough about pregnancy and evaluation, so I'll just move right along. Now, this is where we talk about the health thing, So this was the classical genetic disease that everybody, it was in the old days, the term which was now a no-no, it was called Mongolism, but now it is referred as Down syndrome, which was labeled after Dr. Down, who, based on appearance, described the disease as far back as 1866. And it took almost 100 years to determine the genetics abnormality. And that is the classic abnormality that all of us who even went to medical school that studied biology in the 60s were taught. It's the trisomy 23, as you can see from the slide, that one chromosome, which is in the third, in the bottom row, has three copies. So that's called trisomy. And this is not just, I know, happy little kids, as we talk about, and there's a whole movement about saying, okay, well, there should not be any need for before pregnancy diagnosis. And its standard is recommended that any older women who is over, I don't know, I'm not sure whether it's 30 or 35, I think it's getting younger, but, so that diagnosis is given, and the women is given the choice. Women are given the choice as to whether to continue with pregnancy or not. And I think about within last year, there was an article in the Atlantic magazine that in Denmark, almost 95 to 99% of women are choosing to terminate the pregnancy. So at least in Denmark, Down syndrome may totally disappear as we know it, In the United States, it's because of the people's strong beliefs, that may continue. And it becomes a very moral question, and it has to become between the mother and the mother-to-be type of thing as to what to do, because it's not all, because it's looking after a Down child, I had some limited experience with kids who are born with a heart valve defect, which are very common. And not only that, there are other illnesses that are involved, because recently it has become available that I'll talk more about it when we got to the Alzheimer's disease, but one of the genes called Alzheimer precursor protein is also on chromosome 21. So a lot of these Downs, not children, but adults at age 40, 45, do show sign of early dementia. So that can be a tragedy for elderly parents to look after them and for the society in general. So you can see that is not as, and also that is slightly higher risk of leukemias. So it's not, and not only heart defects can be fixed with surgery, but the other things can become a challenge. So that's becomes a, I'd set up a poll, but I don't think I'm going to, as to what people would do, because if I don't want to lose my slides, because that's, as to what all of you would think. But you can take, just give it a thought as to what you would do if somebody in your family, based on, and the diagnosis nowadays does not require risky amniocentesis. That was the norm, as to sticking a needle inside the pregnant belly. But nowadays it can be done just with peripheral intravenous blood sample, that they can do enough chromosomal analysis to make a diagnosis. So that has become a very relatively easy procedure type of thing, that somebody in my family had pregnancy at age 40 and had to have amniocentesis, but that was in the early 80s, so it's a different story. Now the state of the art has changed dramatically. Okay, now this was the precursor of the classic, first one of the early diagnoses of metabolic basis of inherited diseases. And I mentioned it earlier, but just for completeness, I included that Dr. Robert Guthrie, had devised a test for phenylketonuria, which is an inherited disorder of metabolism, where people cannot metabolize this one particular amino acid. The name is not that important, but it's called phenylalanine for those who are curious. And he devised a simple test based on urine and the chemical reaction. And that was something called the Guthrie cards that were uh, used for a diagnosis. Because unless it's diagnosed early, it can cause severe mental retardation. And afterwards, the treatment is relatively simple with appropriate dietary restrictions. So that he gets the nod for that. And he later on proceeded to diagnose other metabolic diseases also, that including something called maple syrup urine disease and other things, which are again academic, so several other inborn errors of metabolism that were diagnosed. Now, as just to refresh your memory, there are several types of inheritance that take place, and the classical one are the so-called recessive, means you need to get a copy from both parents. Dominant means you would get it irrespective of what, whether you're 100% you're likely to get it. And the other one that you may be familiar with based on history of the rather European royalty charts type of thing that goes back to, you can see the slide starting from the top. In genetic chart, in classical genetics, the females are drawn as circles, male as square. And if they're carriers, that a little is a colored circle. The ones that are affected is the dark circle, green. As you can, I'm sure you can all see my arrow, hopefully. And so you can see that how the females are the carriers and the males are the ones who get the disease. So Leopold, and he gets the disease, and the Tsar, the famous Russian royalty family, they all get now he gets the hemophilia. And that's a famous story of Rasputin, who was trying to treat him, the sickly prince. And this is fairly common, the factor 8 that is the deficient, so that the blood does not clot and they can get hemorrhage inside the joints and even worse inside the brain. So that is why you can see the picture of this young boy who is injecting the factor 8 cryoprecipitate injection. And that's a fairly expensive thing. So it has to be done 2 or 3 times a week. And the cost can end up being as much as $300,000 per year in the United States. And they two factors. One is factor 8 and factor 9 deficiency. They both have the same problem. And at least the common one is as common as 1 in 5,000. So this is, the gene therapy is being used. That's a new thing. And this is not new thing, but you can see the report that this was the gene therapy that was used in this particular patient. This is a report from the bottom, you can see from the New England Journal of Medicine. And after the gene therapy that was given with a virus vector, the gene was inserted by attaching to something called an adenovirus. And so you can see they had a fairly good success rate, just 2 weeks after infusion type of thing. So as long as almost a year that they were able to maintain the levels of the factor 8. So that's the new thing. So this is, now the difference that one has to emphasize that I'll talk about in my future lectures about the difference between gene therapy versus gene editing. So you're inserting the gene, and it may not be taken up by all the cells. So that is, that's the early therapy. And so some of the history is that's how the initial therapy was practiced as far back as, I should say, probably in the late 80s, and in Pennsylvania that was done and they had some bad outcomes, so that set back gene therapy for several years. Okay, moving on to dominant diseases. This is the classic example that I alluded to in the passing in the first class, I think. And this is the famous woman who named Nancy Wexler, both her parents had disease, and I think she was a PhD, and she traced down the family in Venezuela and got their trust and was able to get blood samples, bring them to Boston, and was able to help isolate the genes for Huntington's disease, which is a fairly serious disease that the 3 code repeats continue. And then, unfortunately, the disease manifestations occur at a later age. So by that time, people have already have had children. So that's how the disease just continues. So, and it was the Venezuelan cluster that was diagnosed, and they were able to trace out the family pedigree, and she was was awarded something very prestigious award called Lasker Award for Public Service and Ben Franklin Medal in Life Sciences. So that was one of the pioneer breakthroughs in tracing a real life-threatening. And there is some effort being done for genetic therapy for Huntington disease as well, but that's still a very preliminary work. Okay, last but not least, just for the fun of it, I threw in this is also a disease which is, was well summarized in the well-known movie about the madness of King George. Nigel Hawthorne did the thing, so you may remember that that's his play. It was porphyria, and that is autosomal dominant disease. Again, several types, and it has been hypothesized that the legend of Count Dracula may have been related to this because your gums swell up and you are sensitive to light, and also you go develop a type of psychosis. So there are varieties of rather complex inheritance that takes place, and they have severe pain as well. So this has been hypothesized. Obviously, it hasn't been conclusively proven. So, but that's why, in tongue-in-cheek, it has been labeled as Dracula gene. So, but if you haven't seen the movie, it's a fun movie. It was a very well done movie. So, just to digress. Okay, and another very common disease that we talked about as to how a bad gene can continue and is not eliminated is well-known disease involving lungs, where because of mutation in a particular gene, and as genes by themselves don't do anything, but they create the protein. So cystic fibrosis receptor channel protein that is abnormal. So they have thick secretions inside their lungs and they cannot cough, and it can be fairly serious disease. And until very recently, most of the kids died before they were 25. Now with the modern therapy, some of them, most of them live to be at least 40, 50, and they can have a reasonably good quality of life. And those of you us in medical school remember as to how the parents had to do a therapy as to banging on the chest of these kids to help them secrete the thick phlegm that accumulates. So, and that gene had continued because there is a disruption in the so-called ion channel, which transmits sodium and potassium. This part is a little bit dark, but the chloride channels, they're messed up. So that's how they get the thick secretion, because the water is not become part of these secretions, and that's how they cannot expectorate or spit it out. And so these are the varieties of, different gradations of, but that gets a little too academic as to varieties of mutations that take place, in cystic fibrosis. And there may have been benefit as to why this gene, Mother Nature did not eliminate it, because the mutation may have benefited some resistance to cholera might have been a beneficial effect. That's how it continued and has not been evolutionary weeded out, so to speak. Okay, and one of you in the first class had a question about blood groups. So here's the answer, and I think in spite of looking up other stuff, there is no particular racial or ethnic advantage. There are some areas in Europe, the blood group A may be more common, but the distribution is wide and not very symmetric. As to why these blood groups evolve differently, that there hasn't been any clear-cut explanation, but turns out that this is how the blood groups through the evolution are distributed. As you can see, as humans, all of us know that we have 4 blood groups, A, B, and O. That has to do with the antigen on the red blood cells and the antibody. Chimpanzees have only 2. Okay, bonobos have 1, and gorillas have 1. And this may be simply because of the earlier 2 main processes that I referred to. It is called gene duplication, that the gene copied itself, type of thing, and that's how the blood groups evolved. And there are some advantages and disadvantages, as you can see, as to that may have evolved due to susceptibility to various infections, type of thing. So, and this was one of the earliest work that was done as far back as 1930s by a guy named Karl Landsteiner, who after the first war migrated to the United States and continued work on various other blood groups I think on the East Coast primarily. So this was the classical evaluation that was done. Now, it's interesting, the trivia that one can find out that the Carl Zimmer, who is a very good science reporter that you may have read about his articles in the New York Times, and one of the striking demonstrations of our ignorances came to light in 1952. There is something called Bombay Group. Bombay is present-day Mumbai, that the doctors discovered that a handful of patients had no ABO blood group at all, neither A nor B nor AB or nor O. So this is like, and he gives an analogy that if the A and B are like a two-story building and O is a one-story ranch house, then Bombay patients have an empty lot basically. Okay, so that's, so, and they're still not the worse for it, except it's hard to find blood matching for them when they do need blood transfusion. Okay, so 40% of Caucasians have type A, 27% of Asians do, but why they come from that, nobody has ever figured it out. Some blood groups have a slightly higher risk of cancer, and it's, some groups are more prone to certain infections. So, but those are what they call observation studies, so that is, we haven't found any real evolutionary cause for that. Okay, so enough about blood groups, but so that's the best explanation one can give, that it's one of those evolutionary mysteries that we haven't solved. Okay, and this was just this thing, that this was the famous statement by the first Bush: "I do not like broccoli, I haven't liked it, and I will not eat. So I'm the president of the United States, I'm not going to eat broccoli." So this was, and this may have a genetic basis to it. There are certain people who are more sensitive to bitter taste, and I think, I had about half a dozen slides on taste when I did a class on history of senses, and some people are, and this may have been evolutionary, because during the hunter-gatherers days, when we were going through the plants, it gives certain people advantage. They were able to taste toxic plants, and so there was some advantage. And why that continued? Because they were useful. They were the ones, they were like the Mikey. Oh, Mikey will eat everything. Remember that commercial? Give it to Mikey, he'll eat everything. So that's like, so it was one of those things that there was some advantage type of thing too. And there are tests that can be done. There is a particular chemical, which is, the physicians amongst you would know, something called propyl thiouracil, which is used for overactive thyroid gland. And that's extremely bitter, so it can be used as a taste to see people who are so-called super tasters. Remember, I alluded to when we talked about red-green color blindness, that there are some women who have four, or tetra, they have 4 types of receptors in their eye, and they have a much more finely tuned color sense. The same way there are people who are super tasters. Okay, and so that is some big evolutionary advantage. So it's just to show as to how evolution has continued some of the things that were, and that means, what good is it to be able to taste bitterness, type of thing. So, and some of these things may have advantage because that gives us a protection. There are some anti-cancer properties, so they are used as chemicals, so there are some advantages of some of these toxic plants that are available in nature. And this was one of the things that, for a while, this was a very popular book called the so-called sports gene, and every time, I think people have gone kind of nuts with writing books. Oh, there's a gene for every little thing. So I like, and for a long time, there was back, I think I should say about 10 years ago, somebody had said, oh, there's a gay gene, and that never panned out. Some of these data that comes out and make headlines, makes good headlines in the newspapers, but have not panned out, So these are, and there are some advantages. This was a little bit more solid, that I think I forget the name of the skier, but he definitely had advantage that he had higher level naturally of erythropoietin, which is the protein that gives him more oxygen carrying capacity. And in Winter Olympics, he was just way ahead of everybody. It was somebody from Finland or something. I think, yeah, I think I have the name somewhere, and the book was written, the name is extremely complicated. I'm not going to try to pronounce it, type of thing. So it was a Finnish name. And this was a book by a guy named David Epstein, who wrote a book, type thing. So, and this guy won several gold medals and world championships, type thing. So he had a substantial advantage because he didn't have to dope like the bicyclists have been known to do, type of thing. So he was just naturally, he had a better oxygen capacity, and so he had a distinct advantage. And there are some people who have advantage in their muscle formations also. So there are varieties of and the commercial companies are not too far away in taking advantage of this. They're offering you a gene test to see what type of talents you have, but this has to be taken with a bit of a grain of salt, because it just, I think, to be able to say you'd be able to tell your IQ based on this thing, that is a tall claim, to put it mildly. Okay, and even to say that you have addiction gene, or some types, so those are not that easy to define, type of thing, but this is not well proven. Okay, so I don't think I would jump into that, so, and again, some of the Kenyans, one particular tribe has advantage with their muscle ability, and so they have certain gene called ACTN1 that gives them an advantage with their athletic abilities. So some of the stuff has panned out nicely, others is up in the air. Okay, so enough about that. Now, this was, some of you who read more esoteric things may remember this rather controversial book called The Bell Curve, which had the things about intelligence and class structure in American life. And that book was criticized vigorously, because some of the statistical analysis that they had done were a little over the top, so to speak, and that was criticized as being a very racist view of intelligence that they have done. This came out in the 90s, okay? And again, so then people avoided doing any type of research about intelligence, But recently, this is a recent book that may be of interest. This is done by a rather, a psychologist who has background in genetics, and this was a very balanced view about how DNA matters for social equalities. That as much as we don't, I mean, when in psychology, the big thing was the behavioral things, and the scientist who just died recently, Edward O. Wilson, he was ostracized, and people actually threw eggs at him in the 70s, saying that that at that time behaviorism was in the vogue, and it was vaguely criticized. But now, as people look at it, that there is definitely some element of inheritance of intelligence, and these have been well proven out based on twin studies that have done, type of thing, that some of the stuff, that there is definitely a component. Studies are done with people who have followed identical twins who were brought up in different environment, and that there is definitely as they get older, the inheritance factors become much more apparent rather than the social upbringing environment type thing. So that is, so about so the height, as we talked about earlier in the first class, was strongly inherited factor, about 80%. Some of the other stuff, which became aware, the blood pressure differences in IQ, the genetics thing was as much as 50%. So varieties of these things have been proven that there is genetic does play a small but significant role. So this book is worth reading for those who are more interested in getting more details about inheritance. And it's simple. I'm not going to try to summarize the whole book, but it's like it was a very balanced view that she presented. It's fairly recent publication. by a woman named Catherine Page Harden. Okay, we already have alluded to about lactose, but just for completeness, I threw in this slide as to how the lactose gene evolved at different times. In northern climates evolved, and again in the Fertile Crescent and the Middle East, Mesopotamia region, again in India and in Africa, it evolved. So it has evolved, at the capacity. And this may have something to do with the migration of a group of people from Central Asia. The group is called Yamanya migration. And this has been proven, I'll have a little bit of slides about the population of Europe and South Asia that's coming up shortly, hopefully. Okay, so the gene has evolved because as you can see that the gene is almost absent in Southern Africa and as well as in Asian populations, so they get lactose intolerance. So okay, and now this rather busy slide, which just shows as to how, even though we are all human beings and we're 99.95% similar, there are certain differences that are there in lactose persistence. I'm sorry, goofed up, escape. Okay, let's see if I can focus. There are differences that are apparent in the other genes, and the height differences. The MCMH, that was the muscle gene. It's in the Kenya and other area, and we'll talk about the other Arctic environment, the Tibetan gene that we talked about, as to how it gives them a preference of living at high altitude. This is the thick hairstyle. This is the EDR gene, which Asians have it. What is the advantage that nobody has figured that out? So there are varieties of this thing, and obviously the classical one that we know about are the sickle cell and the malaria. So even though we are all human beings, there are definitely human subgroups have developed different genetic predominance based on the areas where they grew up. So this just summarizes all the changes that are subtle but do have a big influence on. And similarly, the well-known phenomenon is not just good genes, but bad genes also. For example, diabetes mellitus in patients from Finland is very common. Similarly, in a group of Native Americans in Arizona called Pima Indians, they have extremely high incidence of diabetes. And that may be related to, again, a relatively small group where the gene, you marry people in the same ethnic group and that just multiplies. And again, with the exposure to modern diet, the diabetes has almost exploded. In fact, I think there were a substantial number of Finnish population who had settled in northern Michigan. So when I was practicing in Green Bay, we had just learned that, okay, anybody who has the Finnish name, we would just evaluate them absolutely thoroughly for heart disease. We would not ignore their chest pain. Oh, if you're a Finn, yep, you're straight going to the heart catheterization laboratory. We are not going to mess around with it. We don't want to miss anything. So we just learned the hard way. And interestingly, this is small, but how small ethnic groups can, a small group of Brahmins on the east coast of India, due to marrying amongst the same caste, they have a gene tendency to get extremely rare but dangerous reaction after general anesthesia. Their temperature goes up to like 107, 108, and they could die from it. So it's called malignant hyperpyrexia. So a lot of the hospitals, especially in South India, have learned, okay, as soon as they come in, they'll ask, what caste are you? And if they're this, they would take extra precautions so they don't die after minor surgery. So it's just how certain genes can come back and haunt you, so to speak. So it's just a trivia, but okay. And I have some other slides about this thing about coming around as to how ethnicity and various human subgroup, I don't want to use the word race, but it just comes into prominence about your genetic tendency to good health, advantages and disadvantages. Okay, yeah, this is the other slide that we talked about how some of the race and alcohol. There's enzyme called alcoholic dehydrogenase. So the East Asians, they, as soon as they drink alcohol, they get, you can see the picture is quite apparent. They get flushing reaction, alcoholic dehydrogenase, so they don't tolerate, they are getting drunk. So maybe a blessing in disguise in some way, but at the same time, they can enjoy even a simple this thing. So that's a genetic thing as to they're not able to metabolize, and they get almost like an anti-abuse type of reaction. If anybody has worked in the alcohol unit, would recognize that thing. So, okay, so these are, and also some of it might have been, tendency about illicit drug use. It may have been, tendency as to how it is. So some of the stuff, it, works out with various human subgroups, the word as correct word. And again, we have talked briefly about the sunlight as to it's a two-edged this thing as to how it gives you protection from ultraviolet light, but at the same time, it can destroy your folic acid. So on one hand, you're protected from getting skin cancer. On the other hand, you don't get enough vitamin D, so you're likely to get osteoporosis as you get older. So these are the varieties of pros and cons as to with the ultraviolet exposure, and the skin pigment may have evolved in a different types, different further away from the equator. You can see the chart is pretty self-apparent, that thing. Okay, and there are varieties of other theories as to how, and not having hair, and so this is enough about the skin pigmentation that takes place. And again, I alluded to again about the folic acid deficiency, that if you don't have enough folic acid, you're much more likely to get defect of spina bifida, which is that spinal cord doesn't close, and you could get some rip-roaring infection of your spine. And it still occurs type thing, so it's not uncommon due to poor prenatal care in women. And so this again just shows as to how certain ethnic groups are very prone to certain diseases, either due to marrying amongst a relatively small community. For example, in Ashkenazi Jews, the Tay-Sachs disease, which is a very severe mental retardation disease, is common. Cystic fibrosis. This is some other two rare diseases. Dysautonomia, which is your reaction to autonomic system, your like adrenal response that doesn't occur properly. So these are quite common in Ashkenazi Jews. And I don't know if I mentioned this or not, but I'll repeat it, that one of the rabbis in New York City had 4 or 5 children with Tay-Sachs disease. So they had started a organization to screen, in secrecy about if the 2 people are going to get married, if they have recessive genes. And the program has been met. So, and they're advised that if they decide to, they fall in love and if they want to get married, they're advised to go for either in vitro fertilization or adoption. And they've been able to eliminate entirely the occurrence of Tay-Sachs disease in the New York, New England area with secret screening before going ahead and having a child. So it's a very successful program before the modern genetics analysis became available. I forget the name, it's a Yiddish or the name type of thing. So, but that's a very successful way of doing genetic screening while maintaining privacy. Okay, sorry, I should have kept my chest open. Okay, yeah, I think. Okay, yeah, Cindy had 2 questions here. Typing cystic fibrosis, get lung transplant. Would the disease also harm? No, I think lungs are such that, to answer the question, she had a question about cystic fibrosis that get lung transplant, because remember, you can live on 1 lung. So the healthy lung does not, because the mutation has to be in the germline, okay? So it's not, it doesn't incorporate in the germline of the new lung. So that's why they can get away with it, So because you can live with, a less amount of lung tissue. So, I mean, obviously they're going to do a double this thing. So, the mutation has to get incorporated in the germline, so as opposed to the other thing. So that will not, otherwise they would not be considered, type of thing. So, okay. or perhaps a partisan. About that time, Hillary Clinton appeared on. Okay, I don't know about that. I don't know what's the Sesame Street. Her comment was, uh, Hillary Clinton appeared on Sesame Street wearing green and promoting vegetable like a broccoli. Oh, I don't know if it was that, So she made have maybe it's a food for thought. Yeah. Okay. All right. So yeah. Okay. So this is yeah. Sorry, I'll just leave my chat window open so I can pay attention. I got a bit carried away. Okay. So it's okay. Yeah, I had the chat window open, but I closed it. So I'll leave it open on the side so I can see it as the chats appear type thing. So, okay, all right. Yeah, sorry about that. Okay, and this is, a rather complicated slide. I had a slide just with the Iron Man picture on it, which I think it may be coming up next, No, I think I eliminated that. Okay, so let's just zone in on this. This is hemochromatosis, which is a big long name, just means you have increased iron absorption. So you literally, your liver stores iron and you could starts failing very quickly. And it's a very serious disease, so it gets this so-called draw iron. So the free radicals that cause injury. And so survival, this is the book I talked about, Dr. Moem Shalin, the survival of the sickest. So she has a book. This is the name of the book, called The Survival of the Sickest, actually. It's a fun book to read. It's available to the local library. And it's a fairly common inheritance. 25 of European population has at least one copy of this hemochromatosis gene. But the gene does not manifest that easily. So it's like, so even if you're parent, so it's called variable penetrance. So I won't try to get into the details of it, but it survived because it may have given some protection from plague. So that's why they now normally microbes, this is interesting science as to how it incorporates that any microbes will thrive in the presence of iron. Okay, but in macrophages, which are the special white blood cells, in which they can actually protect from this infection, and so that it does give you some protection from this. So that's why this hemochromatosis gene may have survived. That thing. So, and I think that disease was diagnosed based on pathology and symptoms as far back as 1865, and so there is an interaction between various blood cells in the body, as well as so that's why one of the reasons why the gene has survived. But the treatment is relatively simple after once it is diagnosed. That it can this may be one reason why bleeding may have been useful, because in the old days, you remember that doctors used to come and bleed patients. So it may have given some benefit by lowering the hemoglobin, may have caused some benefit to getting better, because otherwise, even though now we can all laugh at it, it is so-called quack treatment. And in fact, George Washington may have died due to repeated bleeding. He had tonsillar infection and pneumonia type of thing, and his his doctors came and bled him about 3 or 4 times, and obviously within the next couple of days he was dead, either from the bleeding or from infection. So there was a very accepted treatment in the 18th and 19th century about bleeding, and so there might have been some benefit that people may have received from infections by lowering the hemoglobin. So either body's resistance type of thing may have improved. So that's why the treatment withstood the test of time. Okay, all right. Okay, so, and again, getting back to something that I've dealt with in the past, which is called, the big long name means familiar hypercholesterolemia, means extremely high levels of cholesterol. There are something called the LDL, low density cholesterol receptors. That is, again, you can see this is quite common gene, as to 1 in 500 people may have. And this can be very serious disease that people can get. If you have one copy, you are at a much more risk for getting heart attack at a younger age, in your 30s and 40s. On the other hand, if you have 2 copies, of this familiar hypercholesterolemia. And then you could get even as early as 18-year-olds can have cholesterol of 500, and it can be very fatal. That I mean, I've seen like a 8-year-old with cholesterol of 400 or 500. I think, and they can be extremely, at least until very recently, they were very difficult to treat. And in recent past, an enzyme in the liver, it's just don't bother with the name, has been this thing, and a monoclonal antibody test, a drug has been available in the market. So people get this injection once or twice a week, and that drops down the cholesterol drastically from as high as 400 to as low as 70 to 100. So it's been a great, and this is also useful for people who cannot tolerate the common cholesterol statin drugs like Lipitor or Mevacor and Pravachol, the drugs that are available, which a lot of people cannot tolerate it because of side effects. So these drugs have been a dramatic improvement in the therapy of heart disease and lowering cholesterol. Okay, and not to get this thing, just most recently, a small molecule RNA type drug has been released. This is the first RNA drug, which is called small inclusive RNA, that has been released by the FDA. That instead of these drugs, the monoclonal antibodies that are used twice a week, this drug can be given only once a year and would keep your cholesterol low. So this is the first time the FDA has approved this actually RNA-based drug therapy. Okay, so there are some dramatic changes that are done based on genetics is coming into vogue for treatment. So this is a fairly serious abnormality, and these are just some of the pictures that the physicians amongst you may have seen during your school days. They get these yellowish patches along their iris called xanthelasma. They get this little circle around in their eyes. In their tendon, the cholesterol deposits occur during their under their skin. These are the pictures of the familiar hypercholesterolemia. And these are some of the earlier diagnoses that were done by Dr. Victor Mikusic that I mentioned earlier, who did the pioneer work on diagnosing the Mendelian basis of disease. So just for academic sake to say that, yeah, that this is. Now, the big discovery, the biggest discovery that started the field of biotechnology, that must be mentioned as to, it was well known for a long time that one type of particular leukemia, which is called chronic myeloid leukemia, which has to do with your the neutrophils, they go berserk and your blood count goes up and you develop leukemia, which means blood cancer. Okay, so this was diagnosed, and for a long time this was diagnosed based on microscopy, that they have something called Philadelphia chromosome. Means inside their white blood cell, that's a little tiny thing that one can see in the nucleus. And because it was discovered in Philadelphia, it was called Philadelphia chromosome. And what had happened was that a part of one of the chromosome breaks and gets attached to a different chromosome. And so that was the little fragment that was visible. And so these are the abnormalities that were a classic thing for chronic myeloid leukemia. There are two types of cells: lymphoid, which is it has to do with your immunity, and the myeloid, which are your blood cells that help you fight the infections. So based on this, a very groundbreaking research that was done, that now this was again very complicated biochemistry that was assessed, that this had particular defect with some particular amino acid called tyrosine. And so based on that, the scientists who worked on it intentionally to diagnose a drug that would block this particular enzyme defect. Because as you remember from the basic thing, genes don't do anything. Genes do protein. Proteins have to do with enzymes. So they devised a chemical that would block this particular enzyme. And that was the classic home run that has never been, the success has never been repeated. And this Time magazine is fairly old, you can see. This was sometime in 2000, but the drug was diagnosed earlier. So this was the biggest success story of biomedical therapy that was done. It was the recombinant. Initially, the story is very fascinating between the two geneticists who were working with cutting enzymes. They were doing microbiology research and working with small viral component called a plasmid. And one enterprising salesperson who listened to this genetic talk and invited these two scientists into forming a company that went on to become one of the most successful biotechnology company in the uh, late 70s, early 80s, called Genentech. And the salesman, forget which company he worked for, his name was Swanson, and the scientist's name was Boyer. And they went on to find initially human growth hormone, synthetic insulin, and that's the biggest success story in the start of biotechnology industry on the West Coast. And Siddharth Mukherjee's book, The Gene, that was one of the popular books in 2016. He does a very interesting story because he was a postdoc at that time on the West Coast, so he had the chance to meet some of these people, and so he tells a very interesting story. And just for those of you who may or may not have seen, because I think PBS did a series on history of genetics, The Gene, narrated by Siddharth Mukherjee. So you may still be able to see it on NOAA or on PBS website. Okay, so that tells you the explanation. So, all right, let's see, the time is, okay, oh yeah, we still have 8 minutes. So, okay, then we'll take a break. Okay, I think, so this was the classic example. Again, this was Genentech's Herb Boyer. So, so these people are, so I don't think, and somehow if you finance a start company, Nobel laureates don't look kindly upon them. So I don't think he was not included in the Nobel Prize winner race type of thing. But this is the complicated thing. But this gets to be a rather, for those of you who are interested, can look through this as to how the plasmid is the small virus component that is inserted, inside the bacteria, E. coli, and then the E. coli just on an industrial basis multiply in big vats, and the gene is inserted by this particular plasmid which works as a vector, and this goes on to form the particular drug. So this gets into a very rather complex thing. So I think if somebody is curious, you can look into it, but it's more technical than you perhaps want to be. Then we a word or two about the cancer genetics that we're interested. Now, this is a childhood cancer, which is very, it occurs, like a cancer inside the eye that occurs in children, and it can be diagnosed based on, eye examination as to how it's a rare tumor called retinoblastoma, as to unpigmented areas of tumor that occurs and is reflected in the eye. As you can see, normal flash photography of the child. Okay, and this was one of the earlier things that this occurs due to a doctor named Dr. Knudsen. He was a cancer geneticist as far back as 1971, that based on numerical data of cancer cases, said that this was both inherited disease as well as occurred sporadically. That inherited disease occurred at a younger age rather than the sporadic, which occurred randomly. And so, and the kids who had inherited disease had tumor in both eyes. So that means they had underlying predisposition. While the one that occurred only in one eye, that occurred at a later age. So then he's proposed something called the two-hit hypothesis, that they had one bad copy, and then again on top of it, a mutation took place. And so that's how the kids ended up getting the disease. So this was the classical thing in the cancer genetics. This was in the early days, this was proposed, and that has withstood the test of time. The first mutation was inherited. The second one was random, which led to the cancer in the so the two hits took place before the tumor could develop. So again, so that's why a cancer requires, one can talk a lot about the genetics and evolution of cancer. That cancer is because when we develop multiple cell lines, that's the price we pay for getting cancer. I think because so that with the smaller organisms, like the E. coli doesn't get cancer, because they're rather simple organisms type of thing. And so this is the multicellularity is one of the price that we pay for cancer. Now again, as you may or may not know, but there are stem cells in various parts of the body that try to repair, our organ. For example, in your intestine, there are cells that are called cilia that help you with the digestion, and there are stem cells in the intestinal wall. They try to repair the intestinal wall. Okay, and the classic example would be people with ulcerative colitis, that they start healing, the cilia that form again. So there is a balance that takes place. For example, even in your liver, there are stem cells that regenerate. Okay, so that's why the liver can regenerate type of thing, part of it. Okay, so there's a fine sense of balance between if there are too many cells, that if the stem cells go overwork type of thing, then they can get malignant, because the more they divide, the more chance of them getting mutations and developing cancer. And on the other hand, if they're not enough, then there is not enough repair of the cell. So the Mother Nature tries to develop a fine balance between repairing the tissue that is worn and torn versus developing cancer. So, and these are some interesting thoughts that people who work with evolution has come up. And the ideas they came from having bird eggs. Okay, sometimes like if a bird, some birds steal other birds' eggs. So they're going to do, or if the one egg falls down, so why doesn't the bird like one extra egg? There'll be like a safety. Okay, but then what happens is that you don't get that much, because if they overproduce the egg, the whole nest collapses. So this is something happens in cells also, that you're living on the edge of fitness, so to speak. And these are some of the very cutting edge ideas on evolution. And Dr. Randolph Nesse, who has done some of the earliest work and has written a book that is a little bit out of date now, was published in 1996, which you can still get it in a used book for $2 or $3, called Why We Get Sick. Okay, and it's still maybe worth reading. And he has recently written a book about think about why our emotional status is related also to stress and evolution. So that's that's a more that was published just within the last couple of years. So he started thinking about this based on the idea about why horses break legs, because the horses are bred for speed, and and their legs are they're just at the evolutionary fitness at the maximum. So if they push a little bit further, the legs are going to break. So they're at the maximum of their evolutionary fitness they're operating. So that's why you can just say, well, why didn't nature make the horse's legs strong? Okay. So that's some of the things about how some of the ideas that are coming out between the fine balance between fitness and health. So the curve. So these are some of the cutting edge ideas. And similarly, the same thing happens in cancer also, that body has something called tumor suppressor genes. Okay. And I think I may have talked about it sometime in one of my other classes. There is a gene called P53, which is called the guardian of genome. Okay. And that is one gene that if you have a malignant mutation that occurs, this gene goes to work and eliminates tries to eliminate this particular mutation. And that's why before we take a break, I'll just finish this story. This gene is considered, like really so much so that it's like big guardian of your genome. And that's why elephants live longer, and they're a lot bigger, they're a lot more cells. That's why the elephants don't get cancer, because they have about 6 copies of this P53 gene. So that's one of the reasons why, even though they're big, they don't get cancer at the same time. And there are also something called oncogenes in the body, so that is the big thing. So as to there is an evolutionary arms race that goes on, not just during pregnancy and conception, but also during cancer. There are some genes that are cancer producing, and there are some genes that are called tumor suppressant genes. So that's one of the paradox of evolution that takes place in causing the serious disease of our life. So okay, so I think we're coming up to 2 o'clock. So and we're moving right along. So we should probably take a 5-minute break, and I'll stick around for Q&A. See that, and we'll meet at let's see, yeah, 2:05 perhaps. Okay, I think I'll pause the recording if I may.